Good. Okay. All right, let's call the order the community finance committee meeting on June 11th, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. Roll call, please.
Mr. Arbogast, Mr. Brisbane, Mr. Kowski,
Here.
Mr. Davis, Dr. Fiorenza,
Here.
Ms. Guerrero,
Here.
Mr. Imhoff,
Here.
Dr. Johnson, Mr. Kohler,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. Odell.
Here.
Brings us into approval of the March 12th, 2024 community finance meeting minutes. And first and second.
So moved.
Second.
I did send a small.
Yeah, and I
correction
made the-
earlier.
And I made,
It was just minor.
Okay.
and I made both corrections and sent you guys an email back saying that I did the corrections.
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you.
Okay, so approve the meeting minutes with the exceptions of Cat and Tasha. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay. Next up, item 3, public comments.
None for tonight.
No.
No.
All right, I don't see anybody personally here, and no one signed up, so. Brings us to item 4, a discussion. Any of our items. So the first up is the district investments strategy and policy, which I think is Brian going to be talking about, or.
Yes, so this was added to the agenda based on a request from the last meeting as a discussion of district investments and strategy and whatnot. So I've invited Audra Brasky and Matt Pitstick from PMA to join us tonight. We don't have anything specific to present, but we figured we would open it up to the committee for further discussion, questions, whatever you guys would like to speak on. I did include a copy of the most recent schedule of investments from our treasurer's report that goes to the board each month as a reference in case anyone needs to see what we're currently holding in terms of investments.
So I can go ahead and just start off by discussing the overall investment strategy that the district has used historically, and then turn it over to Matt to discuss some of the investments in the district's portfolio that have been asked about, if that sounds good.
That's fine, just like a brief overview. All right, refresh our memories. You're good, yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
all right. I was like, can you read? Okay. So overall, the district's investment strategy has been relatively consistent for the last 15 plus years. So PMA works with the district to construct a conservative investment plan that allows for safety of principal, liquidity, making sure you're funding your expenses and you have dollars when you need them for your payroll, for your AP, and then focusing on yield third. We act as a broker dealer in this manner. We don't take discretion. So we are working with the district to construct this plan, and then we're giving the district their investment options, and they're making the final decision. So when some of these lower yielding investments were placed back in 2021, post-COVID, we had been in a zero interest rate environment for some time. The district was entirely liquid because banks did not want funds, and the district and all other districts were earning 1 basis point, potentially 2 to 3 basis points if they had moved it into a different investment vehicle. But you were talking basically zero earnings on all of the fund balance. Right around that time, the district seemed to feel more confident with their construction plans that had kind of gone back and forth for quite some time. So a separate sub-account had been opened for the construction projects, and you had more of a finite idea of when you might start needing those dollars. Excuse me. And then in the first quarter to the third quarter of 2021, we started to see the yield curve upward slope. So instead of being zero across, the first 10 years, right around 3 years, you started to see the yield curve go up to about 25 basis points. And at 5 years, you were still under 100 basis points or 1%. So with all of the other balances at basically zero, the district made the decision to place approximately, I believe at the time it was 35 million out into a long-term ladder going from 2 to 5 years in government securities, which historically have been extremely liquid and that easy to go to the market and sell, and you're just subject to market prices. So the district chose to invest in these securities at two different points, in the end of the first quarter, and then I believe maybe the fourth quarter, to enter into this long-term investment ladder, and went from earning zero to almost 100 basis points. And then rates increased at a pace that was unprecedented, which then put those securities at a market value. And I'll allow Matt to speak to this in more detail. But the remainder of the district's portfolio was entirely liquid. So they were able to rise or ride the yield curve up with all of their liquid investments. So it was kind of a split strategy, locking in some of the dollars that you knew you would not need over the time period, and then leaving the rest liquid to fund your expenses throughout the operating cycle and also invest as rates started to rise. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the troublesome one, okay? I'm the one who just raised the question, and my question raised was more that, and for the record, I spent the weekend in Vegas, okay? And I didn't I didn't gamble at all, but in talking to my friends that gamble, they say, if you make the same bet over and over again, life is good. It's when you all of a sudden just say, I'm gonna bet a whole bunch more, that you cause problems. So what and I'm just translating that, what happened is I looked at this situation is we had made, the transactions we had made, I had never seen anything near the magnitude, for whatever reasons, of 35 million at one time. And we did make 35 million at one time. And as it happens, it was not a good bet. I mean, in hindsight. And so the question is from a evening out, of the resources, because the minute you start doing, our investment strategy is to be conservative, but I think it's also to not try to, beat the market. It's not try to play the market. And the way I see this playing out is that we put a lot of chips on the table all at one time, which was very atypical, and I had not seen in the decades before, when we had more money available. Now maybe it was committed, so my question is more about that, and is there anything from a policy standpoint first, which is kind of somewhat handcuffing, and then a practice standpoint second, that would be beneficial, to say, don't, you mentioned there was a ladder that was done, so that's kind of in one way of doing it, but it just seemed like a lot of money all made in a very short time that was put in, and we bet, and we at the end, as you said, things were on a rapid climb, and we had a lot of money tied up in a low investment, and it cost the district significant money. And so I'm just I'm asking about policy and practice.
So from a policy perspective, Illinois school districts are not limited to a time constraint. They're limited to specific investment vehicles allowed under state statute, and you have districts that are basically in your financial profile that are investing in actively managed portfolios that are 10 to 15 years out. So it's not it's not uncommon for districts with fund balance that had looked like yours at the time or look like yours to have a longer term investment strategy. The timing of the market is definitely, PMA's always said for the majority of districts, 1 to 3 years is considered long term. We had been in a zero interest rate so long, and you had another 50 to 60 million sitting liquid earning nothing, that the district decided to lock up some of the long term in that ladder where you had investments maturing every 6 months. So you would have the ability to take them back, into your operating cycle if you needed them. But historically, you could sell a treasury and then use it or reinvest it, and the penalty would just be market rates. Historically, however, we never saw interest rates rise that quickly. So from a policy perspective, there's nothing prohibitive in state statute or in the district's investment of policy currently. But from the other investments for, I want to say 2 years were earning, the other balances were earning zero. So as those investments rolled off, we have then reinvested them, and you're looking at 5%, which is substantially different. But your district and other districts with similar long-term balances, specifically Cook County, because prior to COVID hitting, you had received all your Cook County taxes, whereas the Collier counties had not. So they were in a state of, we don't know when our revenue is going to come in. So Cook County districts the majority of them went longer term to generate some type of yield.
Yeah, and thank you, because I when I characterized what my perspective was, one, I only caught half of it. Half of it, the first was the quantity at one time, right? And the second was the fact that, again, in the 10 years that we had $100 million fund balance, we never went out beyond, I think, 2 years. We might have had one. I mean, it was 2 years or less, and this was 5 years, I believe, at the high end of the list. So both were structural changes, are different than what we had been doing. And that obviously the market was different, whatever, but they were different. It wasn't like we were just playing the same game over and over again. So that's why I raised the question.
Well, it is obviously a valid question, and historically, I would say you never had been entirely liquid. And once taxes were received in March of 2020, from then on, there was no place to put dollars. So there was a lot of frustration with the fact that, districts are sitting on, hundreds of millions of dollars and earning zero. So your district was not alone in looking for any type of safe product that provided some type of yield.
And so you said historically these were easy to sell, but is it the case that you can't sell them now because there's just no demand because of the rate? Is that the situation?
So I can have Matt speak specifically to the illiquidity that happens in the market when rates rise very quickly and you bought at a lower rate, just specifically using one of the securities as an example.
So yeah, as Audra had mentioned before, normally historically treasuries are extremely liquid and you can just kind of sell them off whenever you need, and there's not too much of a delay. But you do run into that problem when the rates rise that fast. You run into an issue where you are subject to the market rate. So right now, if we're going out and we're investing, if it might be about a 5%, you won't be able to sell that treasury to somebody else at that 1%. You're going to have to do something to bring it up to that market rate of around 5%. And with these investments, the way that happens is you'll end up taking a loss. You'll have to sell it for less than you purchased it for, so that the buyers, when you take into consideration that discount that you're giving to them on top of the interest earned, will have to come up to around 5%. So we ended up running an analysis after speaking with Brian, and we looked at the current holding investments and just see if we were to sell these in the market today, how much money we would get. And we were able to look through them all, and none of them, given the loss that would be incurred upon the sale due to the massive increase in rates, which we have never seen before, all of the investments would end up earning more, or at least like would end up being better off for the district to stay in the investments being held, or compared to selling them, taking that loss and reinvesting it into a higher rate. When we looked at all of them, the district would come out better by maintaining just the hold on the investments that you currently have.
And
Because-
and I will quickly, sorry to interrupt, Matt. I will add that our trading desk is running these swap analyses regularly, and really in an efficient market, you shouldn't be able to sell an investment and then purchase another investment with the same level of risk and make a profit. So that's consistently being run with our trading desk to see if maybe we can move these low yielding investments into something with slightly higher risk, like a certificate of deposit. Because back then there were no banks wanting to commit to bank product. They didn't want to lock anything in when they could just have funds at zero. And throughout this time period, with rates rising so quickly, there has been no swap opportunities that are within the district or state statutes risk profile.
Any other questions for Audrey? Audrey or Matt? Oh, thank you guys very much. I don't have any questions. So move on to the next thing. So thank you guys for attending and giving us just a quick overview of that. So
Thank you.
I think you satisfied on questions or
Yeah, I mean, I just really need to change anything, and I mean, I don't.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything
Or if
that we're thinking about.
right, at the, for the committee, if there's a thought of needing to change it.
So I don't think so, right? Oh, yeah, we can see any, let's look for changing. Okay. All right. So,
Well, we appreciate you allowing us to come virtually, and I appreciate my children for being quiet for the last 18 minutes. That is really so. Thank you for allowing us to jump on virtually. And if there's any follow-up questions, feel free to have Brian or Tony reach out to us, and we're happy to address them.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
All right, next up is item 4B, project 2 debt options. And so we have Elizabeth Hazy here for us.
Yeah, so we're coming up on budget discussion tonight, and with the new fiscal year is when we had tentatively planned to issue the debt certificates associated with project 2. So to give us some an update on the market and what those types of issuances may look like, we have Elizabeth Hennessy here tonight from Raymond James, and she's going to walk us through a presentation that'll give us an idea of what this potential debt certificate issuance may look like for us. So I'll pull up the PowerPoint on my screen here, Ed, and then Elizabeth, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me. So it'll start with a little market update. You guys have this screens printed out. So speaking of markets, interest rates have been quite volatile, but have come down since the record highs of December, January of this year. So what I have on this first slide is the tax exempt AAA municipal market data yield curve. So that dark line is the yield curve for the past 30 years. And I'm glad you can see it on your screen. On my screen, which is pulled up from the website, I think Google does this. Or the presentation, some of the axes are off, but it is on the one that Brian's showing. On the x-axis, we have the year of maturity from 1 to 30, and on the y-axis, we have the yield. And the dark line is the average on each point of the yield curve for the past 30 years. The red line is where we are now. So as we're just talking about the after 11 rate increases by the Federal Reserve, short-term rates are higher in the tax exempt space than longer-term rates for the first 7 years. Then after that, the rates are below the 30-year average, and that is by about 10 to 20 basis points. So we're in a bit of volatile time here. The Fed has talked about reducing interest rates if economic indicators point in that direction as soon as this fall. Many market minds think that it's going to take longer because inflation is a little bit stubborn and not coming down as quickly as the Fed would like to see. So, but where we are now, we are lower than the 30-year average. If we go to the next slide, we're looking at treasury bonds or investment rates. And again, looking at an average since 1996. Brian, could you go to the next page? Thanks. Again, over 30 years, the average yield curve has lower short-term rates and longer-term rates. But because of these rate increases on the taxable side, the difference is much greater. The red line represents investment opportunities for the district because you invest in US Treasuries. So those short-term yields especially are very high, over 5%. All right, let's go into our financing options. And in February 24, the district determined the final funding options for project 2. So the estimated cost is $102 million. It's funded from operating fund balance, $44,220,000. Imagine Foundation, $12,500,000, and debt certificate proceeds, $45,280,000. So the following options look at the timing for the issuance of the debt certificates based on the preliminary draw schedules from Gilbane. So given the draw schedules, it appears that the district can meet some of the expenditure exceptions to arbitrage rebate and benefit from these high short-term interest rates. So let's step back. Arbitrage rebate refers to the money that you have to pay the IRS back for earnings that you earn on the investment of the proceeds in excess of the yield on the bonds. And you need to pay that back within 5 years or after 5 years. So you need to track it very carefully unless you meet one of the 3 exceptions. There's a small issuer exception, which is 15 million or less, and there's 2 spending exceptions, which you do meet because according to the Gilbane draw schedule, you're spending this money really quickly. You see the progress going on over there. So look at page 8, just see where we're at in terms of the issuance of the debt certificates. So these interest rates are based on AAA tax exempt rates as of June 3rd. And for the 20-year repayment, which is what we've been looking at, all the review of options, interest rate is 4.18%. That's the all-in true interest cost, including estimated cost of issuance. And it is, as I mentioned, as of last Monday. So the estimated interest cost is down there over 20 years, and our rate is 4.18. So that is not the arbitrage yield. The arbitrage yield is without cost of issuance, and that's closer to 3.9%. So that's what the IRS looks at. If you earn anything over that 3.9%, that difference needs to be rebated to the federal government unless you meet one of these spend down exceptions. All right, so let's look at, well, this first option is our original option on page 3, dated December 1 of 24. If we do the same thing and we move up the issuance, and I know this may seem a bit unrealistic because we are sitting here in June 11th, but let's say we move this issuance into July, issuance sooner, locking in these rates that are available today. We will have the opportunity to invest the money for another 4 months. And we can make more positive arbitrage, which we can keep, you can keep, because we're meeting the spend down exceptions to arbitrage rebate with the schedule provided by Bill Billing. So let me show you that schedule. First of all, let's go to page 10 and look at the difference, the additional cost of issuing in July, probably would be by August at this point, but by July versus December. If interest rates are the same, because we're issuing sooner, you've got a few more months of interest to pay on the bond, on the debt certificates. So that difference is $598,107 difference issuing July versus December. That difference is for the debt certificates repaid over 20 years. So that's for the full 20-year period. What is the difference in those additional months of interest? And as I was mentioning, the district will have the ability to invest the proceeds for a longer time if we issue them sooner in July or August, and therefore more interest. So because you're paying these from operating funds, you know, the interest you pay versus over time, you're earning interest in operating funds to earning capital projects fund. So it's not a separate levy, but let's go to page 12 and talk about arbitrage again. As I mentioned, unless you meet certain exceptions, it has to go back to the federal government 5 years after the bonds are issued. So the spend down requirements, just to issue tax exempt bonds, you have to expect to spend 5% in 6 months and 85% within 3 years. So you do that. That's just to issue tax exempt bonds. We go to the next page. Brian, sorry, I'm on 14. The exception to arbitrage rebate is a small issuer when you issue 15 million or less, or the spend down exceptions. So the IRS rewards issuers for spending the proceeds fast and lets you keep any profits because it's going to be small. So let's go to page 15. The first one we'll talk about is the 18 month. There's 6 month, 18 month, and 2 years. So the 18 month spend down exception means that you got to spend 15% of the proceeds of the debt certificate plus the interest you earn on it within 6 months, 60% within 12 months, 100% within 18 months. So the 2 year spend down exception on page 16, the next page, gives you actually 24 months. So 10% in 6 months, 45% in 12 months, 18% in, or 75% in 18 months, and 100% 24 months. Okay, so that's the 2 year. Both of them accept you from arbitrage rebate. If we go to page 17, based on the Gilbane spend down, you meet the 18 month exception to arbitrage rebate. So if you see in the yellow lines in the column, if we issue these in December 1 of 24, you hit the 15%, you're at the 15% target, which is in May of 25, you'll have actually spent 42%. If you look at the November of 25, 60% target, you will have spent it all. So you are, if you issue this in December, based on your spend down from Gilbane, you're going to spend this money in 11 months. That's really bad. Doesn't give you much time to earn interest either. That's why if we go to the next page, we look at scenario 2, and if we move it back and issue these bonds in July or August, you also meet this 18-month exception to arbitrage rebate. So if we issue in July, which I know seems a little unrealistic, now this end of June, early July, December is your first target date. And there you've spent 23%, you only need to spend 15%. And then in June of 25, you're supposed to be at 60%, you're at 70%. So you meet the 18-month spend down. And the rule is if you miss one of these targets, you are subject to arbitrage rebate for the whole thing. But you also could go to the 24-month exception. Because if you miss one of these 18 months, which you've seen based on the spend down, you're gonna make the 24-month for sure. It looks like you're gonna make the 18-month easily, but 15 months of investment earns at 5%, generates $1.63 million in interest. Versus if we wait and issue in December, based on this spend down of 11 months, you're only gonna make 1.1 million in interest at 5%. Okay. And the other thing to consider, if rates do start to come down in December, if inflation gets more under control, you know, we may not be able to earn 5% on these short-term interest rates like we can now. So that's another reason maybe moving this forward sooner rather than later. So if we go to the discussion on page 19, issuing the debt certificates again sooner, July versus December or August, as soon as you can pull it together. The interest earnings difference is approximately $525,698 over the 15-month period. But issuing in July versus December will cost you more, $598,107, which is more, but that's over 20 years. Okay, so this short-term taxable rates gives you an opportunity. And if we just look at the estimated all-in cost of the 4.16 versus the 5%, we can do just some more math. If you invest a bond proceeds at 5% for 6 months, that's $1,132,000 versus simple interest cost on the 45.28 million at 4.1. 6% for 6 months is 941,000. So the difference there is, you know, 190,000 if we just look at a 6-month period and simple interest based on the arbitrage yield on bonds. So it's not as great a difference, but it is a difference, and that can help you shield you against cost escalation and any risk you have with the fundraising and those kind of things. So I think in this interest rate environment, you should consider moving the agent up. Questions?
I've got one for the district and then one for Elizabeth. To the original financing numbers, we had the pretty big 12.5 million coming from the foundation. I just wondering kind of an update on sort of where they're at. This bit of difference here isn't going to plug a hole if that number is way off. So I think that's what it might piece I'm hung up on, I guess, on the reading these two options. Do we have an update on kind of where they're at, or do we know? Is there? I guess I don't know. Do they have a date where they're shooting for, or?
I do know that. I'm trying to remember here. Just recently, they changed their estimate from 12.5 to 15 million. So
That's good.
Okay.
So that's
Going in the right direction?
Yes, yeah. So I mean, that's a vote of confidence that the 12.5 is firming up.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know how much of that, you know, again, they're in the earlier stages of this process, but it's all kind of based on projections. They have, you know, a base of commitments, et cetera. They've already given the district $1 million. So I would say that there's been no signal from them that has said that we should not expect the $12.5 million.
The question for Elizabeth is, because it's been a while since I've been in the arbitrage world, does all the pieces on timing and the amount of arbitrage and spend out, does that impact the ability to refinance these if rates drop at a later date?
No
Doesn't matter.
relation. And by the way, 20-year bonds, you maybe haven't talked about this for a while, but you know, bonds are not, or debt certificates are not callable like a mortgage. You can't just refinance them anytime. You have to wait to the call date. And the call date is typically 8 to 10 years after issuance. So the first opportunity to refund them would be about 7 or 8 years out. Now, in 2018, Steve probably knows this, they administration changed the rules about advance refunding them before the call date. And the rule said you cannot advance refund bonds on a tax exempt basis. It would have to be taxable. And it's very unlikely that's going to save you any money because taxable rates are higher than tax exempt rates. Now, there's talk in Congress, they may change that back. So we're hopeful there's legislation proposed which would give you one opportunity to refund the bonds in advance of the call date on a tax exempt basis. So we're hopeful that will happen. But you know, if we make that call date any shorter to allow you to refund them, the rates come down, you know, like in the next 5 years, we can lift that, but it's very expensive in the market. The rate that investment would charge you for that option it can be quite steep. So we can look at something closer to 8 or 7 years, but you know, again, the closer we get in, we will have a higher interest rate than you otherwise would. The more standard call.
Thank you. Guys, this is the first time I've seen the word arbitrage and stuff. Is this like something specific, like this the debt certificate or something? Like I've never seen this when you're talking about
Every
like
tax
bonds.
exempt, every tax exempt.
That's because you've been around school finance when rates were in next to nothing for all those years, so it hasn't been coming into play.
Okay, I've seen this word on like I sold the bond before in D97, so it's like I've never seen arbitrage as a word. Okay.
It's just because of that one curve you showed where the red was so far.
Okay.
Way above the blue.
That's right. It's a really unique market.
Okay.
I've got a question. So what happens if we don't stick to these spend down, projections?
So if we don't,
Like if there's a delay in the project and, it doesn't go as planned, which can sometimes happen, and then what happens then?
but if you miss one of those targets, you have to pay arbitrage rebate back on the full issue. So there
How
goes
much
your,
is that?
well, there goes your difference. We're looking at about for 6 months, 190,000 that you could keep now based on your drawdown. But if you miss one of those targets, then you have to pay it all back to the federal government after 5 years. Now, as I mentioned, there's 2 exceptions. There's an 18-month and the 24. So, I mean, right now, Gilbane is showing a draw schedule. You are spending this money fast. And before we do any bond issuance, we better go back and check again, right, Brian, just to make sure that nothing has changed. But,
Right. And the other thing that is not factored into that draw schedule is owner costs, so things like architect costs and consultants and other type of costs associated with the project outside of what we're paying in terms of the bid awards and the construction manager fees.
Just on that note, just a follow-up question. I mean, because, in terms of the drawdown, what constitutes spending? I mean, is it the date that the work is done? Is it the date we get the invoice? Is it the date we pay the invoice? How?
well, according to Chapman and Cutler, it's when you obligate the funds. So maybe when the invoice comes, you don't have to have the check written in cash.
Okay.
It just has to be invoiced and word approved, and then it's spent.
So, I mean, because that you know, granted, I do think you said that they're gonna blow through this money quickly. But, any delays in billing or such like that could be detrimental, so.
Right, you can include all the soft costs that Brian was mentioning. You could also approve a reimbursement resolution to let you pay yourself back for things that you've already spent your own money on, and that would be a good idea because it would be like an insurance policy. So if you need that reimbursement resolution to meet a spend down, you can say, well, I'm allocating this bond proceed to money that I spent in the last 60 days. You can go back 60 days from the time of issuance, given that reimbursement resolution.
So on slide 16, it says at least 75% of the proceeds must be spent on construction expenditures. So that would that include like that type of reimbursing the district's own cost or the architect fees or all of those would be
75% is just construction.
just construction?
But you know, then there's 25%.
That can be spent on those. Okay. Thank you. And then I guess my other question is there any argument for just waiting, like just trying to wait out the high rates? So just waiting and spending the fund balance part of the money on the project first and then seeing if rates are down, 12 months out?
Well, you know, I think you should spend your bond proceeds first, no matter when you get them, number one. Because your own funds are not subject to arbitrage rebate. You can get the 5% on those money. In terms of what's gonna happen to the market in 6 months, as we've talked, there's a lot of speculation that if CPI comes down and PPI and, it starts looking a little more recession-y, that's gonna make the Fed lower rates to try to stimulate things, but it just hasn't happened, and I am not a gambler with regard to those market. If I was, I would not be sitting here doing public finance with you guys if I knew what the markets were gonna do. I think if you've got something that's within your financial wherewithal, within your rate projections, within your operating projections, it's affordable, and you can make some additional positive arbitrage, I would, as your financial advisor, I would say that bird in the hand is probably more worthwhile.
You just hit on what my next question was, just as a point of reference, which is when we made the decisions. Right now, these both come in at 4.18, 4.16, that's the number. What was the number that was used when we were building our models and making our financial decisions?
I can look that up. But I would bet it's higher because these numbers that I'm showing you now do not have a cushion in them.
The other ones all had a 1%, 100 basis point. Yeah, so
Yeah.
but this is an important number, and the number is
Back to.
We had a 5.
it had a 5?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think-
yeah, I feel like there was a 5, so.
Ooh,
All right,
good.
here's February
I
8th,
like 5.
24.
I like 4, but I know that. So what was the number? Do we have it?
I'm sorry, I'm coming up.
Oh, okay, you're perfect.
Slow.
Yeah, it's slow.
Patience? Doesn't have patience. That's the number.
She's pulling up, when is the board? Like she's presenting examples for like looking at this summer, but when do you guys meet in the summer?
We have regular board schedule, except we do not have a July 20. We only have a single meeting in July, the 11th of July.
So you probably need, do you think you need more than one meeting to talk before you act?
Our basic practice is that we don't decide on things that are presented.
Yeah.
At the time of, so we have a cycle, and that is the one time we actually skip a cycle. I mean, you gave us July, August would be you know,
Just
a notch between the two, right? I mean,
And you've got 2 meetings in August, right?
we do have 2 meetings in August.
You want anything this month? June,
No, we have,
right,
what's today?
June 11th.
We have our next regular board meeting is the 20th of June.
Mhm.
And then we have a committee, I'm sorry, and then we have a regular board meeting on the 11th of July,
Special board meeting on July.
a special. So. And then we go to committee in early August.
Okay,
Yeah, but I think great questions of, how quick.
yeah, like you guys are, you would present probably at the earliest July, and it would, as you said, 2 meeting rule, so. When August meeting would be the earliest you could make a decision, so you're looking at. September is the earliest if we want to do it right away. The September pictures.
And just, yes, yeah, that's probably realistic. And I'm just going back to the slide, which is page. So I'm gonna ask probably one of the more stupid finance questions ever, which is. On page 19, because you're saying that. The difference between these 2 bookends that you've given us. July and December is. December is $500,000. I'm rounding, right, of.
Interest
More
earning.
of interest in the short term, and the other one is 600 over 20 years. So. Is that? I mean, in present day dollars, or is that both in the same terminology?
Not really. That's why I did the example
Yeah.
of just doing 45.28 million at 5% for 6 months versus 4.16% for 6 months to give you, a 6-month simple interest because I just think it's a cleaner way to look at the difference. And you can divide it by 6 and keep it monthly, plus or minus, but we're looking at investing over a period of time where the draws are all kind of, goofy. And so that's where we get the 525 extra interest earnings. All right, so going back to our big slide. Well, back in February, we were looking at an all-in true interest cost based on February 7th with a 50 basis point cushion of 4.27%. That's what we're looking at in February. So higher, but not that much higher.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The same.
Yeah, pretty much the same.
You know what? I take it back.
When we were
Four
discussing
point
those,
seven two.
23,
4.7.
so that's what we had the 5 numbers, this is all my last summer discussion, last fall. I think. Oh, probably,
Yes, it was
it was last fall, so the difference between last fall and this, is when you guys actually made the official decision.
Last fall.
Yeah. When this committee discussed, I think it was like October, November.
I think it was further back than
Oh,
that.
further back.
Yeah, I mean, I guess whatever the date is, I keep always going back to anchor to the date that, we put it in our. Long-term financial model, which, our 5-year model, and then extend, what was it then? Because that's really what we made decisions on, and if it's better or worse.
It's better.
4.72 versus 4.18.
I mean. Just found the March of 23 CMC presentation.
Market. Okay. Yeah, well, great then. That's probably the last one we saw.
CMC.
For March of
And that was the 4.7.
No, that was February at the board.
February this year.
24.
This year.
Yeah, the
When
board
the
said it, but they
decision
saw
was
February.
made to go for debt certificates.
Yeah, when they officially made like a motion and to do that.
No, it wasn't 20, it wasn't, was it? Was it 23 February?
23.
Yeah,
Oh, 20.
yeah. It was made last year, not, what month, I don't even, what month are we in? June. It was not, it was made over a year ago.
Right.
Because it
Okay,
was
so
before,
I was right, it was November
it was
22.
before the election, and Brian, you would have, I mean, whatever's in the.
Yeah,
In the culvert.
that anchor you were talking about where we kind of show a historical percentages on the fund balance to expense ratio within the 5-year projection, that was a March 2023 date.
Okay, so March 2023 CFC presentation 4.72.
Okay.
And that's a 1% cushion then. Okay, so rates were lower in 23, they were still on the way up. And since this February,
Yes, they were trying to last February through January, and then they started going out.
Okay.
So from this presentation and our questions, do you want us to discuss and make a decision? On like when our thoughts and opinion on issuance of whether we should wait or as soon as possible?
I have one more question.
Yeah.
What's the risk? What's the downside? So if we borrowed earlier, the downside would be we didn't make the payoff calendar. And
that could be a risk.
Okay, and then we wouldn't earn that extra 200,000.
Right, I don't think it's too likely of a risk.
Right.
Since we're showing that you're spending the money in 15 months, and if we can go to 2 years and hit these targets, I think we should be okay unless we get some radically different information from Bill Bain between now and the time we go.
But even if that happened, would we be no worse off than we would have been if we just borrowed the money in December?
The only worst off is you pay a few more months of interest,
Right.
which is at 500 million.
Okay.
Over the 20.
Got it.
So if we issue sooner, we pay more interest. But if we issue sooner, we get more interest income,
I would just,
like a.
yeah, I would just say the risk though, that extra 598 will be offset, even if you get capped on the earnings by arbitrage rebate, you'll earn at least the arbitrage yield on the bonds, cover the interest costs. The only interest cost you wouldn't be covered is the interest cost on basically the cost of issuance. So I think it's small, the risk of losing money on that. Accelerated issuance is very small.
And not meaning to spend down doesn't seem that likely. If you're funding it all from the debt, I think you'd be more worried about it, but it's, you know, less than half the project is funded from this, and so you're just paying the earlier part out of the proceeds, and then you're spending the fund balance and the donations for the second half of it.
And they thought the timeline is supposed to be done by summer 26, which is basically 2 years from this summer.
Yeah, I mean, from
So the
a,
2 year, she only showed 18-month roll, but 2 year basically sounds like it would be like, yeah, like you said, like the math is mathing in theory. As long as there's sort of on schedule, I think I'm not seeing an issue with arbitrage.
And where you tend to see the payments slow down seem to be at the tail end of a construction project, you know, as things are being closed out, punch out lists are having to get completed. That's where some of those, you know, you got retainage being held back. That's where the payments tend to drag out a little bit longer. But when you're talking about drawdown cycles, the first half of a project, it tends to be closer to those estimates than the second half, I would say.
Remember, the reimbursement resolution is a bit of insurance that if you need to pay yourself back for things that you've already spent money on, you can do it. And that's a great way to get bond proceeds out of the arbitrage rebate control, because if you pay yourself back, it just goes into your operating funds, which are not capitalized.
Off the hand, Brian, you have like some soft cost that we, can number, and it's probably just a million, maybe. I don't know, you paid the architect and all that stuff, but you paid them so far.
In terms of expenses we've had so far.
Yeah. Like that rough guess or estimate.
Well, I mean, we'd be looking at a 60-day window in front of the debt issuance. So I mean, we wouldn't be at that point yet, but we are getting regular pay applications at this point from Gilbane.
I have a crazy question, because your slides show $102 million and the breakdown between the three different funding sources. Somewhat on top of this, we have this geothermal work that we're doing, okay? That is gonna be more money that we're spending, but, we have not, that we're spending, and we will be using our resources to do that. So would it be to our benefit in any way, shape, or form to include that? I mean, I don't know, I mean, when you say from this whole arbitrage discussion, or, would we benefit? And what would be the pros and cons of including that in what we spend? Just, it gives us more, I have no concern about spending the money, for two reasons. One, if we have a very tight schedule that we need to adhere to, that is all around our school year. This is all carefully choreographed, and it had better be right, okay? And the second is it's only a fraction, and the heavy work is front loaded. Okay, there's a lot of detail, stuff that's gonna be done. So I don't have a concern, but I'm just saying you always want to put yourself in the most favorable position. So is there any pro or con to saying that those dollars count towards the project?
Sure. Debt certificates can be used to pay any capital project.
Yeah.
So you easily could include the geothermal in it. The only negative of doing that is you might spend it faster and not earn as much interest as you otherwise would. But it's a nice backup to have that project to spend these debt certificate proceeds on. But
that's another one that has our choices of what we can do and when are not, it's navigating use of the facilities. It's very, very tight schedule. I just.
To your original sort of idea, I guess my thought is the board said this is how we're funding project 2.
Yep.
We're using X million dollars of debt. Before that, I think if you muddy the waters, if you change that up, that's just.
I see your point. You're kind of trying to say just throw that in if.
Well, I mean, Elizabeth's saying we can kind of do this, whatever it is, this, I call it a look back, but a resolution, just a way of saying, okay, we spent this on it, we spent this on it. I mean, we're spending a lot of money on capital. And we've got our 10-year maintenance work, and we've got a lot of different pieces to the puzzle, and we're spending a lot of money. So I just want to make sure that when we do that, we know which ones count towards this 18 and 24 month thing, so that we're keeping score the right way. Because it would be painful to say, guess what, you just did it, but you kept score and you lose. So
we want to avoid that at all costs. I mean, and that's why it just takes careful management of the bond proceeds and keeping track of the expenditures. And I mean, if you look at these drawdown schedules from Gilbane, I mean, you're gonna start getting bills of over $1.5 million per month starting in July.
Mhm.
And, yeah, I mean, you're doing a lot of work. as you
Yeah,
should.
it's gonna be great, yeah.
Mhm. So, you know, I think it's a management, it's expenditure management process, and just keep an eye on it. And if you need to reimburse or you need to do something, you can manage that so you don't miss these targets. And again, I don't think we're tight at all on these targets, given that you're spending everything in 15 months based on this. And you could go out to 2 years, 24 months, you know, meeting the targets if you had to. I put the 18-month in here, because it seemed to work perfectly.
And can you clarify, you said it, I didn't quite grasp it. Why you say we are better off spending the money we borrow first?
The reason is because it is subject to arbitrage rebate if you don't make one of these targets. So you better, it behooves you to keep the interest rate difference by meeting these targets and spending that first. The money in your operating funds, you can invest at as high a rate as you can possibly get. There are no restrictions on that. So that's why the bond proceeds could possibly be restricted if we miss one of these targets. So let's make sure we don't miss those targets. Spend it first. The operating fund money in your fund balance has no restriction on the yield that you can earn and keep. That makes sense?
Yeah, and I'm just trying to understand the value of the different, you know, where we can win and lose, right? So arbitrage, you said, if we play it according to this, the arbitrage benefit is $192,000, is that what I think you said?
Over 6 months,
Yeah,
over 15 months is gonna be higher. I mean, with moving this up to July, based on the draw schedule, you're gonna earn 1.63 million. Now you're gonna pay something else, right? So that difference is the, over 6 months is 100 million. But there's some real dollars to be made. Not enough to make up any shortfalls in your donation, but there's some positive money in this interest rate.
This means 5%. Or we earn 5%. Because that's your estimate, yeah.
Yeah, I think you can earn more, but that's what I use for the estimate. And on the investment side, as Brian knows, you know, you use PMA for your investments, they do bond proceeds management too. Which this is gonna be separate from all the rest of your investment earnings, and it's gonna be tracked. They're gonna tell you how you're doing every month. Important records to keep.
so Brian, one number that I would like to know, you know, is if we went with something like this, which is now a 418 versus a 472, what does that mean to our picture? Because that's another variable, right? I mean, that should be favorable, right? In our model. So somehow or other quantifying that, and you're gonna have to do it over a certain amount of time, right? But what does that mean?
Well, the payments
Right.
that we showed in March of
Yep.
23 were like 4.6 million. And now we're at 3.5 million in this presentation. So-
But you can do, you understand the question?
I believe, right, I believe in the end of the preliminary budget, I think there is an updated forecast with updated numbers from this, Brian, is that right?
Preliminary budget is still working off of the initial debt certificate scenario we looked at. So the one that's over a year old. But
Okay.
I mean, in rough, you know, in rough dollars, what we had set up that initial debt issuance to be was to fall within like a $3.5 million annual debt service payment. And then on slide 8 of tonight's presentation, you can see the annual payoff with these bonds is more in the range of a 3.3 million. So roughly 150 to 200,000 per year less.
Okay, yeah, because the 3.5 million number is ingrained in my brain. And so, yeah, that, I see that's covered here, $165,000 a year of
Yeah, over 20 years.
favorability. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I could get you that exact number as well.
All right,
Yeah, let's see, debt certificate payments, this is the 5-year.
Mhm.
So so 3, 4, basically 3, 5.
Yeah, 3.5 was the number that we
Yeah.
used, I remember, so,
Relatively close, that one's.
okay. So the question is, yes, the finance committee, you've got our, outside and it would be healthy for a recommendation to go through to the board.
Recommendation, whether we're okay with doing now or later, basically. So now would be whenever you can, because that's not gonna be July 1st, clearly. It'll be at September 1st at this point, I think, based on your calendar. Or December,
I think to give
or
Mhm.
later than that.
you the most flexibility to do a reimbursement resolution in July or August if you can, and then plan to issue, in the next couple months after that.
Okay. I'm in agreement with that. That's right.
Yep.
So, okay, resolution, maybe a resolution, or she called it. Issue that, or
Reimbursement.
reimbursement resolution. We're in agreement, we're okay with that, and then issue. Sooner rather than, okay.
As soon as.
As soon as
As soon as
yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean,
We won't put a date on it, because, you guys got.
Right. But if you did that reimbursement resolution, that really kind of would allow you to do something that looks like the scenario one, because you can capture those July, August, September expenses, something like that.
Tax, yeah, that's 60 days.
Again,
you capture the expenses, but you're not getting the interest. Right?
Well, we're just
But you're not paying
assigning,
it.
yeah, so when you get the bond proceeds, whatever you paid, say $3 million, then just goes over into your operating funds right away, it's counted.
It jump starts your spend down.
Jumped, yeah.
All right,
To make an official motion.
well, there's not a vote to that, right? So,
That's the right.
okay, I think that's fine.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
It's good time,
Thank you.
good to see you guys.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, item C, the 2024-2025 preliminary budget.
Okay, let me switch over to that presentation here real quick. Okay. So I like to kick off our budget discussion for fiscal year 25, just with a quick review of our budget timeline. Now the budget's a continuously evolving document, as we all know, and it covers about a span of 9 months. So it's a lengthy process, but there are 3 checkpoints along the way for public discussion. Tonight's the first of those checkpoints with the committee's opportunity to weigh in. Then the Board of Education will perform its initial review in August, and a final version of the budget gets adopted in September. As a refresher of our process, we do utilize a zero-based budgeting method for compiling expenditures. And what that means is that we essentially start from scratch each year. So salaries and benefits get budgeted by individual employee. Our capital budgets are developed using bid awards and draw schedules like we've been talking about. And then other spending areas are based on itemized requests that come from our district budget managers. Revenues then are primarily driven by the annual tax levy, but there are a number of other factors such as enrollment and economic conditions that go into estimates used for other sources of our revenue. So now we'll get into some more specifics regarding the fiscal year 25 budget, beginning with revenues. Last December, the board approved a property tax levy that aligned with the CFC's recommendation, which was for a 3.5% increase plus new property. Because that levy was less than the maximum 5% permitted under PTEL, our property tax revenue budget is essentially already known at this point. We're still waiting on official tax rate and extension releases from the county, but that levy of less than the maximum has essentially solidified our budget. Corporate personal property replacement taxes, or CPPRT, are the opposite when it comes to degree of certainty, and that's because of their recent volatility. These revenues were at an all-time high in fiscal year 23, but have since declined pretty sharply with signs that those decreases will continue into next year. So we're currently budgeting for a 13% drop in that area for fiscal year 25. Interest income is projecting favorably as interest rates remain elevated. If we look ahead, these revenues are expected to peak for the district in fiscal year 25 because rates will inevitably start to decline. So we've kind of built that assumption into our projection models. And then also our fund balance reserves will be relied upon to fund Project 2. And then lastly, we're budgeting several grant revenues to decrease as we enter the final year of our COVID relief grants, and the state continues to prorate some of the special education reimbursements. However, there is a one-time capital grant we're budgeting for next year that is keeping total revenues in these categories inflated for one additional year. This slide outlines the revenue budget in comparison to the fiscal year 24 budget. In total, within the blue box, you can see that next year's revenues are expected to be almost 7% higher than the current year's budget. The column to the right of that blue box then estimates where we think actual revenues will land for fiscal year 24. Most of the lines are trending to be right on pace with the budget, with the exception of other local sources. And within that category, the CPPRT revenues and Imagine donations are both running under budget. As a result, we're estimating about $100 million for total revenues, which would be about 2% short of what we budgeted. Slide 6 shows a side-by-side comparison of the district's budgeted revenues by source for next year versus this year. With a high reliance on real estate taxes for funding, there's rarely a change of more than 1 to 2 percentage points in this chart from year to year. And you can see that theory holds with the next year's budget as well. I'm just going to pause here for a moment and see if there's any questions on revenues.
I not a comment or question, but I just want to remind the committee that when we did the levy for the last levy, there's that what do you call it? That if we had any unforeseen reason, we could go back to and increase the levy. Not something that's
that recapture resolution.
Recapture, thank you, all these terms. So we did file that, correct, Brian?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
And that's that safeguard that kind of we have it in our back pocket if CPI were to, drastically decrease and we had a need to levy more than CPI in one of the next 2 years.
And the time frame of that is what's the window?
There's a 3-year window on it.
3 year, okay. Thank you.
I mean, I was just gonna say that the increase in revenues year on year versus where we think we're gonna end up in 2024 is pretty healthy. It's 9%. So.
Yeah.
Hopefully that means that we wouldn't need to be captured.
No, I'm just trying to make sure that, because we've been through a lot of different cycles, just so that we're all understanding the same.
Yeah.
As
I
is.
forgot about that one.
Yes. All right, thank you.
You're gonna go on ground with no more questions.
Okay, so then switching over to some expenditure items of note. Personnel costs make up the largest component of the school district budget. Fortunately for us this year, salaries for all staff groups have already been approved and factored in. Now there will be a reconciliation that occurs after the first payroll of the school year, just to ensure that any turnover or position vacancies have been accounted for. But the fact that no contracts are still being negotiated at this point produces a higher level of confidence for us in this area of the budget than we've had in previous years. In employee benefits, health insurance makes up more than half of our costs on this line, but it's always challenging to forecast at this time of year. And that's because our plan year aligns with the calendar year rather than our fiscal year. So, really we're only 3 to 4 months worth of claims into our new plan year at the time this preliminary budget is being done. While that does mean that premiums for the first 6 months of next fiscal year are already known, we don't yet know how those premiums will change on January 1st. And although final premiums typically aren't settled until October, we do work closely with our insurance advisors over the summer to monitor that claims experience so that we can have a better feel for what increases to expect before the budget's final adoption. In the meantime, though, we've used our standard assumption from the financial projection and budgeted for a 7% renewal increase on January 1. The third bullet point is a consolidation of purchase services, supplies, and equipment. Combined, these accounts make up only 12% of the total expenditure budget, but together they are forecasted to increase 15% from the fiscal year 24 budget. The items driving the increase can kind of be grouped into 3 categories. First, there were some unforeseen needs, meaning the costs had not been identified within our previous financial projection. These expenses mainly pertain to technology. Some specific examples include enhancements to the security camera system to address blind spots in the building and repair and or replace some existing cameras. And then there's also a purchase of some student laptops for use in engineering labs. The second category contains expenses that were included in future years of the projection, but they had to be accelerated. In this case, we had a math textbook adoption that was expected to be phased in over a couple years, and it had to be moved up to fiscal year 25 because the books currently in use are no longer available. Then the last category is for contractual cost increases that exceeded our assumptions. We had some new contracts for transportation, electricity, and natural gas that were all entered into within the last 18 months. And they in all cases, they replaced contracts with rates that had been more favorable to the district. The transportation contract, for example, was approved just after the last budget was adopted, and it included a 2-year phase-in of rates. So fiscal year 25 will be the second year of that rate increase. So that was an assumption we knew would need to be adjusted coming into budget planning this year. For the utilities, it was a matter more of not realizing how good the district's rates were in the previous contract. So to prevent a similar situation from occurring again in the future, we decided to split out utility costs as a separate assumption within our financial projections. Previously, those costs had been grouped in with miscellaneous supplies, but it's become clear that these multi-year energy contracts that we've been entering into do not follow the typical increases due to inflation like ordinary supplies would. So we've taken measures there to kind of, help us in that regard with projections for those costs in the future. Then at the bottom of this slide, we're all aware of the capital work that will be underway in fiscal year 25 between Project 2 and the geothermal project. We also talked earlier in our debt discussion that we'll have a new expense line in next year's budget for debt service. Here's another chart comparison of next year's budget to this year's budget, this time for expenditures. Once again, the charts are very similar, but you can see capital has taken a little bit more of the pie from salaries in fiscal year 25 as our Project 2 and geothermal project get into full swing. Slide 9 presents a table summarizing the expenditure amounts. The section circled in blue shows the budget increase for operating expenditures at $6 million or 7%. Even though that increase is similar to what we saw with the revenues, it's worth mentioning that the budget is an evolving document up until its adoption. From my experience, the first draft tends to be the most conservative one because of the number of unknowns we're still dealing with. June is a very heavy month for both payroll and accounts payable. And as we get later into the summer, we're able to start filling in the blanks in terms of how we actually fared in fiscal year 24. And then we can go back and fine tune some of our estimates to be based on prior year actuals rather than prior year budget. So we anticipate that percentage will lower some before September. Then the bottom half of the slide lists our expected capital and debt expenditures. One thing we have to watch for here is the potential for timing variances between years on our multi-year capital projects. An example of this is with Project 1. Currently we have no expenditures budgeted in fiscal year 25 for Project 1 because the project is mostly complete. But there is a final payout outstanding that may need to be added in the next draft of the budget if it's not paid for by June 30th. And we could see similar things with Project 2 and or geothermal, which will extend beyond fiscal year 25. So it's just kind of monitoring those expenditures on those projects as the year wraps up. Any questions on expenditures or comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna just dovetail on what Petra's comment was on the prior one, which is compare estimated actual to budget. I mean, we always look at budget to budget and that's one comparison. But if you look at estimated actual to the budget, which is this is what we spent and this is what we think we're gonna spend, it's a 10% delta, which is, that's pretty substantive.
Yeah, and that's where where I was talking about the numbers for fiscal year 24 becoming a little bit more clear for us here in a month or so, as well as some of those extra contingencies and conservative estimates that are currently built into next year's budget will, inevitably start coming down a little bit as we get closer to the start of school year. Some of those estimates become knowns. And so forth, but yes, that was something I noticed as well.
And I would call it out, and just to put a comparison of those two as we kind of mature through the process, because that's to me, I've dealt with budgets for too long, and it's you got budget over budget or budget over actual, and you need both. in looking at things, so.
Okay, sure.
And I'm a little bit kind of fickle, is that what it's called? No, you know, back in the days of the finance, the FAC, et cetera, part of the challenge is it was always looking at a budget on top of a budget and leaving that delta off to the side, and it is not good process, so. Got some pains from that one. All right, I'm done.
Anybody else? No? Okay, yeah, you're good to go, Brian.
Okay. Okay, we've already discussed the debt certificate issuance tonight. Just a reminder that the payoff of the debt is subsidized by transfers from the district's operating funds. The preliminary budget we're looking at tonight currently assumes a December 2024 issuance with one interest payment in fiscal year 25. But you know, if you know, in taking CFC's recommendation, if we move up the issuance date, then subsequent versions of the budget will be revised to show the additional interest payment. So then on slide 11, we get a look at the big picture impact of the budget on the district's fund balance. Total operating funds in the middle of the slide are expected to have an initial surplus of $8 million, but after transferring $4.3 million for capital and debt service, the net result is a $3.7 million increase to fund balance in fiscal year 25. In terms of our fund balance policy, the $69.3 million ending fund balance in green equates to 75% of operating expenditures. Then within the non-operating funds, there's a lot of activity in the capital projects fund, as we would expect, but the difference this year is the debt issuance. In previous years, this column for transfers, other sources, and uses would typically net to zero because we're just transferring money from operating to capital projects. But this time you can see down at the bottom in yellow how the debt issuance is providing $45 million of funding. So the non-operating fund balance at the end of fiscal year 25 is estimated to be around 16.3 million, with almost all of that representing debt proceeds to be spent on Project 2 expenses in the following year. Now, again, that may change depending on the structure of the debt issuance, but that assumes that December 2024 issuance of debt certificates. So part of our preliminary budget analysis also includes a look back to identify changes since the last 5-year projection, which in this case was done in October. Some variances are listed here on this slide, but I think it'll be more helpful to look at the actual numbers. So I'm going to jump forward one. So on slide 13, we're looking at the operating funds. And in the top line labeled total revenues, we're budgeting a 1% increase since the last projection, and that largely comes from interest income. You know, last year at this time, the economists were predicting several interest rate cuts throughout 2024. Those haven't really materialized yet. So in this case, that works out in the district's favor. In the expenditure section, the overall variance is an increase of a little over 2%. The purchase services, supplies, and equipment lines are the ones applying the most pressure there due to the reasons mentioned before, between the technology needs, the accelerated textbook adoption, and some higher contracts for transportation and utilities. Then in the transfers section, the transfers for other capital number has gone up to help fund the geothermal project. That project had not been officially approved as of the October projection, so that is an addition to this year's or this model. So where does that leave us? At the bottom of the slide, you'll notice in blue that ending fund balance from the preliminary budget and the last projection are both about $69 million. Because our expenditures are trending to be under budget this year, we're estimating we'll be starting fiscal year 25 with an operating fund balance that's $3 million higher. However, our budgeted expenditures in fiscal year 25 are also now higher, which means the fund balance to expenditure ratio highlighted in green actually drops a couple percentage points to 75%, despite a similar ending fund balance. In comparing the budget for non-operating funds to the projection, an expense line has now been added for the geothermal project. Also, now that project 2 bids have been approved, we've updated the timing of expenses between fiscal year 25 and future years to match the estimated draw schedule prepared by our construction manager. That also causes the projected fund balance at the bottom of the slide to be higher because there are more debt proceeds remaining as of June 30th to be spent on project 2. As is the case with any budget, assumptions have to be made for certain unknowns. This list highlights a few significant areas we'll be monitoring between now and September for potential changes. A lot of these same items appear on this list from year after year as we're doing budgets. With property taxes, there's always uncertainty with cash flows from Cook County, which then has a trickle-down effect on the district's investment income. Since the district uses CPPRT revenues to fund capital projects, the magnitude of the decline in fiscal year 25 will determine if we need to dip further into our reserves to fund those projects. Then insurance renewals and special education outplacements. We should have more clarity on both of those by the start of the school year. And then lastly, there is inherently some uncertainty whenever it comes to private donations until that money is actually received. To show where this budget positions us beyond fiscal year 25, we have an updated model of our 5-year financial projection included in the meeting packet. A condensed version of just the operating funds is presented on slide 16. As you can see in the row highlighted in green, the significant drop in fund balance in fiscal year 26 is the main storyline. That year includes the largest share of project 2 expenses, which will first consume the residual debt proceeds, and then we'll need to transfer money from the operating funds to cover the remainder of that project. So that explains the outlier of this negative $43 million shown on the total transfers line in fiscal year 26. Fiscal year 26 is also the first year when the operating fund balance finishes within our targeted range of 25 to 50%. And then it stays there in subsequent years of the projection, albeit in the lower half of the range throughout that time period. The rebates from the geothermal project are currently slotted into fiscal year 28, which gives us a temporary boost in the fund balance, but then there are some spikes in the 10-year maintenance plan work scheduled for the summers of 2028 and 2029 that if we choose to continue funding those from operations, will bring our fund balance to a low point of 27% by the end of fiscal year 29. Here's the graphical view of that previous slide, which just shows projected fund balance by year in relation to our targeted fund balance range. Again, you can see the steep drop off between fiscal years 25 and 26. And then the last item for discussion we have is a couple recommended assumption changes that we're bringing to the committee for approval. The first has to do with finding a standard data point to tie to for non-union employee salaries. After reviewing the historical data in the key assumptions summary, We noticed raises approved in previous years for these employee groups have generally been very close to the CPI factor that applies to PTEL. The previous assumption in our model had used flat 2% increases. So this adjustment would make our model more conservative because CPI for the upcoming levy year is already known to be 3.4%. And then we assume a CPI of 2.5% for future levy years. So that would be recommendation number one. The second then would be to include a placeholder for 2 additional faculty member salaries in future years of our projection. This would not be for fiscal year 25 budget because we've already got staffing set, but this would be starting in fiscal year 26. Currently, our assumption holds the staffing level flat unless we see an increase in projected enrollment. However, the reason for our recommendation is we occasionally have staffing requests for reasons other than total enrollment. One example would be the recent influx of students requiring bilingual services. We feel including this contingency into the model would add another layer of protection against particular surprises that may crop up down the road, particularly as we start drawing down fund balance in the near future. So with that concludes my portion of the presentation. I first just wanted to see if there's agreement within the committee regarding making these changes to our projection model, and then we can open it up to any other questions regarding next year's budget.
But as far as the projections, what specific items should you just kind of repeat which ones you're looking at or wants to discuss? What changes, or just you're just saying in general the changes you're showing us?
Yes, these 2 specific ones from this slide. So the change in percentage increase for salaries for non-union employees, and then including this contingency for staffing.
I have questions related to that page, just for clarification, Brian. The 2 faculty, so that's a one-time addition of 2 FTE?
So that's it's kind of like a perpetual inclusion of 2 extra faculty members. So whatever we think staffing will need to be for fiscal year 26 plus 2. Same thing for 27.
Correct. Okay, I'm just trying to understand because most of these. So okay, so it would be a +2 and then whole.
Yeah.
This and I can provide color on that if needed. But the second one, you mentioned earlier that healthcare in the budget is 7%, and is that consistent with the current assumptions in the projection model?
Yes, that aligns with our current assumption.
Okay, I know those numbers have bounced around a bit, so thank you.
Discussion on those likes, dislikes of those 2 things.
Both things then.
Yeah. They seem to yeah. So we're all agreeing to find those assumptions.
Okay. Good. Yeah. The only reason I bring them forward is just to kind of keep a log of our changes within that financial projection model. So each time we update, we just kind of have a running notation of changes we made to kind of refresh our memories.
So we appreciate that. Every time we get updated projections, having that list, like, oh, okay, one change here is very helpful. Because otherwise, you're like going, why did it change? Then not having those notes can be frustrating. So, thanks for keeping that record for us. Questions on the budget, on the preliminary.
So I have a question which you might have already answered, Brian, but when I saw this latest and greatest, the fund balance chart that's on slide 17. it looks different than the way it normally looks when we see it. So normally, those yellow bars are more in the middle of the range and not so like that 27% in the 28, 29 projection is the lowest one we've seen. And I just was looking back, at the same chart from a meeting a year or so ago, and it looks better, right? It looks we look like we're more in the middle of the range than at the bottom of the range. So I'm sure you just explained this, but can you just say again, why is the projected balance lower than we used to think it would be?
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of a few things. So number one would be the inclusion of the geothermal project. So that was not in the previous projection. Number two is the revisions that were made to the 10-year maintenance plan that kind of shuffled some costs around between years, and the tail end of our 5-year projection, I should say, is when some of those higher years of costs in the 10-year maintenance plan start creeping onto the 5-year projection. So then we need, additional funds to be transferred from operating funds to cover those costs. And then I would say the third thing is this kind of revised estimate of our CPPRT revenues. We had been projecting a kind of a steady decline in those revenues after reaching that, high watermark in fiscal year 23. But we've seen that cliff drop off quicker than we even expected. So now we've added some additional conservative measures there in terms of those revenues to where, we're looking at, in this model, we're looking at more of a baseline of $2.5 million per year, as opposed to back in October, we were looking at, 3 or a little over 3 million as being our low point.
Okay.
One of those topics, just I want to provide 2 seconds on, which is that the revised 10-year maintenance plan was presented to the board recently. I'm trying to remember, it was one of the last meetings at our cow. I'm trying to think of the last week, I don't know. It recently, okay? There was an ask because it did not, compare it to what was done in the prior, to our anchor. So there's further work that needs to be done to provide that, but I do think that information needs to come to this committee. You're talking about $70 million of, it's significant dollars in capital over a 10-year period. And there's financing considerations, et cetera. So I do think we need to make sure that information gets to the committee, even if we can determine how and what, but it's substantive.
Just to be clear, since we're at $70 million of third maintenance, that $70 million just a big chunk for a garage, right? Because $70 million over 10 years sounds like a lot of maintenance costs. I'm pretty sure the big chunk of money, $70 million 10 years for your garage. I think.
I would need to.
Yeah, but I think it does. And I've seen an old iteration that had like $30 or $40 million of that was related to garage in 2028. I just don't want that number sounds high.
Okay. My point is that I think one is it's been changing and there's been better vetting with the, having it incorporated with Gilbane and others looking at it. So it's been a deeper dive, but it's substantive. Okay.
And none of that are project 3, 4, 5 items, right?
That was the second ask, which is it's nearly impossible, right, to say this is totally without those, and so there is some bleed over. There is overlap, and there was an ask to try as best as possible to parcel those out. I mean, without having firmness of what and when project 3, et cetera, so it's complex. But that, you just hit the two were, how does it compare to what we did when we, what I call our baseline? And then, what's been changing, and then what are the longer term imagined pieces that are intersecting? We'll get more information.
I think it's a great idea to bring it to us so we can also understand it.
Yes.
I haven't hardly heard anything about it.
Questions, comments on the preliminary budget piece for Brian. I just had one quick comment, just like I did some quick math. So it's like, and Steve, you asked that question earlier about do we have any clarity on when or if money will come in from the Imagine Foundation? And so like I did notice in the 5 years, like it was more detailed, they did say they kind of budgeted out between the next 5 fiscal years, $11.5 million that they haven't gotten yet. And so hopefully they get it, because it looks, if you take that out just quick, I'm just mentioning this. In the out years, so all of a sudden all that money, like let's just say tomorrow the jobs just don't get anything. Like it looks bleak where it's the operating, let's see, the fund balance, 73 for this coming fiscal year, and it goes 27%, 21, 22, 16. So like really looks like 34 versus 27. It starts to dip below. So
Well, I think some of the budget to budget, actual to budget tweaking, I hope will change these numbers a little bit too, as this fiscal year becomes a little more certain and the budget gets fine tuned. I think there's some cushion in there.
Yeah. But your observation is the same as mine, which is when you see 27, right, you're starting to ride the rails. Okay.
Right out of money.
And that's a whole different world. And that is assuming that you're getting $12.5 million. It is assuming that you're getting the geothermal reimbursement from the federal government, right? Or from the
IRA.
What?
Inflation.
IRA, yes, yeah, IRA, right? So, gotta play the, gotta be on your game here. This is not.
Okay. So if there's nothing else with the preliminary budget, they listed out for next year all the meetings. Just as reference when they're gonna be. And if you're also, Lisa, did anybody reply yet to your email about staying on or dropping off the committee?
I heard from everyone except for you
Yeah.
and
Okay.
Mr. Davis.
And Mr. Davis.
Yeah, and I just emailed him this evening to ask him just to.
Okay. Yeah, so the dates are set. So go ahead and put on your calendar. If you said yes to Lisa.
Is that kind of trying to do the same thing we do between the cow week and the board meeting week?
Yes.
Looks like.
It's a Tuesday before, after the cow.
Yeah.
And before the lunch.
Yes, next one for us to be August 15th. All right, future agenda items, anything anyone want to add or want to think about?
I actually have a question about the investment group that we're using and how often we change them. And I don't know if that's something we want to add to the agenda.
I'll give you a little bit.
Steve Miller can answer that question.
They are the only one, because until maybe, let's say the late 2000s, the district was under an entity called the Township School Treasurer's Office. The pooled investments from Oak Park System and Burnwood School Districts. When that entity was abolished, then the district was investing on its own, and as far as I know, they've always utilized PMA since.
But is it worth to get a second opinion? A second look at.
There's definitely other
And
banks,
others,
there's definitely other banks out there. My district utilizes a number of them. The trade-off is it's a lot more work on your end if you're like, okay, we just got $5 billion of tax money in, send out all the emails, who's got rates, what do they got, and you end up doing a lot more work. And maybe for some basis points here or there, maybe not. Having it all in one place has some benefits, and it's not the way PMA, they're really the approved investment advisor for the Illinois School District Liquid Asset Fund, which is a pool that's administered by the Superintendent's Association, the School Board Association, the School Business Officials Association. So it's a little more than just with PMA. But again, there's lots of there's other pools that are out there run by other groups, and lots of the big banks, Chase and Fifth Third and Wintrust all have groups that focus on local governments and can provide options too.
just wondering if, based upon the history and, what happened and, whether it would be good for us to go out and just, seek, another firm and see what they can do for us. And maybe even, review some of the, the details of the situation that we ran into, right? Could we have done things in better? Are there things we can learn from, that we can do differently so that we don't lose out on that opportunity that we lost out on?
I don't recall if the investment policy really talks to the selecting of sort of the investment providers. It has lots of stuff about what you can invest in and concentration risk, kind of all of that sort of stuff. I don't recall if it really talks about a process for selecting who you invest with or not. Again,
I think, well, I'll go, Tony, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to throw out as a potential agenda item. I would, I said, I think the 10-year maintenance plan.
Yeah.
Throw it on the, somewhere out there and what form and fashion, but I do think it would have merit. One thing that we're doing at the board, just to make this group aware of, because we are trying to provide the administration with a, for lack of a better term, a template of what is required or expected when we get a board report. Okay, what is it that we want to see? And a significant part of that are board reports that ask for resources. Okay, that have and I'm going to give you some specifics on that, which is that if you have a report that is saying that's in the finance part of the agenda, and it says we are being asked to approve a rate increase of for a school bus carrier from $100 to $120, we need to monetize it. I mean, we're approving funds. It's a financial decision, so we want to make sure that anything that we're doing in the finance section has certain minimum information. It needs to be in dollars. We need to have what was budgeted and what is actual and what was last year. So the same things, that all that information should be in a request. This is work we're doing. I'm just sharing it because it might be helpful to get any other ideas of standards from when we get a board report. We're handling it on the board governance side, but I'm just sharing it with this group because a heavy part of it is the finance reports.
I like that idea. And it's sort of like, there's a process, I can't remember what they call it in Springfield, but when someone's proposing a bill, it's maybe an unfunded mandate, they can ask for the financial analysis of it as part of the bill writing process, and then some organization has to kind of go through and crunch the numbers and say, here's what the financial impact of this bill would be. So it's similar to that, I like it.
Yeah, a second an additional thing that we're doing, because what we're trying to do at the board level is focus our discussion on things that we're gonna vote on, right? Things that we're taking action on versus focusing our discussion on updates on things, et cetera. We can all read. And, you know, it's up to, we're being paid to make decisions and votes and policy. So we'll put more of our time on that, which means that everything else, we need to leave good breadcrumbs so that people that are new to a committee or new to the board can find the history. So as an example, we made a decision on a date in February of last year to approve something, et cetera. This discussion we had with Elizabeth earlier, we should be able to go right to that point and say, we voted on the 7th of March. Here's what the presentation we voted on. So we're trying to do a couple things there. So it has ripple down effects because, you know, it should pertain to things that come, because our work comes from this committee, right? So just, that's more, I don't know if it's future agenda, it's just me updating you on things. Okay. All right.
Anything else? No, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Oh, okay. Thank you.